from Beijing's perspective, the world's changed and become much more difficult, it would seem to me, over the last 2 or 3 years as a result not only of America taking the position it has, but also because it's been able to garner support, raise awareness. There's been a coming together, the Quad, and so on and so forth. But really, they've got a number of very troubling issues, haven't they? I mean, their own economy, levels of indebtedness. They've got Hong Kong. A lot of pressures on them, one way or another. It's not the world that they thought they would be operating in.
Well, I've been traveling to China, teaching in China as a visiting professor at Tsinghua for quite a few years. I have always been told by academics, by Chinese officials, that China's principal problems are domestic. And in the end, they spend more time worrying about those than they do about global expansion. And I believe that, because the domestic problems are enormous. You have inexorably bearing down on the Chinese growth rate the population problem. The legacy of the one-child policy is such that China's working population is shrinking. And as it shrinks, it is more or less inevitable that China's growth rate will fall too. The Chinese population, the working population, is going to shrink by something like 200 million between now and the end of the century. The period when China's comparative advantage lay in abundant cheap labor coming to the towns from the countryside is over. And there's not a lot they can do about that, because you can't wave a magic wand.
The people are not there.
And you can't just produce the people. There's virtually no immigration to China. Robotics might help, but they don't really make the kind of robots that would do the job. Try Japan, try the United States. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is that in their response to the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, the Chinese greatly expanded credit in almost every direction. And as a result, the financial system and gross indebtedness expanded enormously, so that in broad terms, the debt to gross domestic product ratio for China is about the same as it is for the United States, which is remarkable for a relatively less developed economy, which is still a middle-income economy if you look at per capita gross domestic product. The nightmare scenario for China is that the growth rate falls over the next 10 or 20 years, and China doesn't make it out of the middle-income trap, remains essentially a country that is quite a lot poorer on a per capita basis than the United States, even if in an aggregate basis its gross domestic product has got quite close to that of the United States. So that's another problem. Third problem. We all worry, I think most of us at least worry, about climate change. And if we don't worry about it, we're made to feel that we should. Problem. The percentage of the increase in carbon dioxide emissions since 2007 accounted for by China is more than half. The percentage accounted for by the United States is zero. The percentage accounted for by Europe is zero, because the emissions of CO2 in the United States and in Europe have actually gone down since 2007. After China, next up is India, which is something like 20% of the total, and then the Middle East. So the real question in the climate change debate should be not what are we going to do, because we're doing it. The question is, what are we going to do to constrain China? Because the Chinese say one thing and do another.
Yeah.
They say, we're committed to green technology. We're going to invest in solar. We're going to have electric cars. And people in the West go, oh, how wonderful. Marvelous. Well done, China. What they don't notice is that at the same time, China is building a new coal-burning power station every week.
They have more coal-fired capacity under construction in China today than Australia has in its entire grid.
Exactly.
It's extraordinary.
So that's the reality. Yeah. All the debates about climate change, from my vantage point, are just virtue signaling unless we get to the question, what do we do to make China and India rein in their CO2 emissions? Because whatever we do, the planet's in trouble if they carry on like this. And they show no sign of reducing this. I mean, the trend line is absolutely clear. It's steeply upwards from bottom left to top right of the chart. So that's the issue. And that's a problem for China two ways. One, at some point, people are going to notice that this is it. This is the issue. Two, they have their own environmental
They certainly do.
Reasons to worry.
Yes.
Elizabeth Economy at the Council on Foreign Relations some years ago published a devastating book on the environmental costs of China's breakneck growth. And by the way, that's a familiar story because communist parties tend to cause environmental disaster when they do high-speed industrialization. The Soviet Union did it too. If you have at the core of your economy a lawless one-party state with a substantial state-owned enterprise sector, there will be environmental degradation on a massive scale. And human health will suffer, the environment will suffer, the planet will suffer. These are China's problems.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to that in a moment because the way the West responds may end up damaging the West for no global outcome benefit whatsoever.
Oh, it's highly likely. It's highly likely. That's what the Europeans are already at the point of self-immolation on this issue. But if you just come back before we get to that.
Yeah, I'd love to come back in a moment.
To where China is.
Yep.
You mentioned Hong Kong. I do not think that Hong Kong-like protests will happen on the Chinese mainland in the foreseeable future because, number one, mainland China is now under such extraordinary surveillance.
It's almost a digital prison.
Well, it certainly is like something out of science fiction, isn't it? And it's kind of beyond George Orwell. Yevgeny Zamyatin wrote a wonderful book in 1921 called We. And in We, there is a one state, capital O, capital S, in which there are no individual human beings, there are only ciphers. Everybody wears the same uniform, and the apartments are made of glass so that there can be no privacy. That's China today. There is no privacy because the data that are gathered via network platforms like Alibaba and Tencent, the data are essentially accessible at will by the government. And the government's using social media and other data, including financial data, to build social credit scores that track not just whether you're a safe bet for a lender, but more generally, how do you behave?
Yep.
Do you spend enough time as a party official reading Xi Jinping thoughts? There's an app for that. So this is not about to produce revolution in the streets, because the minute you say on WeChat, hey, why don't we get together, to do X, doesn't even need to be political. The minute you start getting together in China, the authorities are onto you. So Hong Kong is absolutely sui generis, and I don't think we should expect contagion. But I do think that Hong Kong poses a problem, because if I'm sitting in Taiwan and I'm looking at what's going on in Hong Kong, I realize that the idea of one China, two systems is a fantasy. That Hong Kong's semi-autonomy is for the birds. Ultimately, the rule of law in Hong Kong is going to be hollowed out, and gradually Hong Kong is going to be subordinated to Beijing, where it matters the most, which is law. So I think the implications for Taiwan are very clear. You can't allow yourself to be drawn into the orbit of the People's Republic of China so much that the same thing happens to your democracy. So given that Xi Jinping's ultimate objective was to bring Taiwan back into the fold and essentially have one country, one system, I think that's in deep trouble as a strategy. Or at least a showdown is coming, and it may be coming quite soon.
Yeah, elections next year.
In Taiwan, elections are coming up. The issue of what is happening in Hong Kong is extremely important there. So I think that's a long enough list of China's problems to be going along with. There are a bunch more we could talk about, but I think those are the central problems.
So the reality is that China's now surrounded by people, if you like, in the Pacific Rim, that part of the world, that are well and truly onto them.
Yeah.
But strangely, where we are here in Europe, it's a different story altogether. There doesn't seem to be any particular engagement, no energy, no great sort of focus, no unity around the question of China. And extraordinarily, Henry Kissinger has indicated that he's a little concerned that for all of that, Europe may end up, as he put it, an appendage of China. What on earth did he mean?
Henry Kissinger recently looked back on something he'd written in the 1950s. I'm in the midst of writing his biography, so It may have been that I turned this up, but back in the 50s, Kissinger asked himself, could the United States end up being a kind of offshore balancing power to a Eurasia consolidated under Soviet rule? Now, that didn't happen, and it didn't happen because the Europeans understood the Soviet threat very well. And it wasn't a difficult choice. Stalin or the United States? NATO was formed, and ever since that point, there has been a strong American commitment to the defense of Western Europe. The difference is that today, I don't think the Europeans feel anything like as threatened by China as they were by the Soviet Union, and that's understandable. It's further away.
Long way away.
It seems much less ideological. The Chinese show up in Europe and they say, we want to invest in your, let's take one example, in your port, the Greek port of Piraeus. Or they show up in Italy and they say, would you like to sign a One Belt, One Road document and become part of our exciting initiative to invest in infrastructure? So the Europeans are highly susceptible to those kinds of blandishment. In addition, European corporations, take the German automobile manufacturers, think that China's the future.
Yeah.
It's just got to be a bigger market. They
Well,
look
the
at the
sales have
numbers.
been extraordinary.
Right. So they look at the numbers and
You
it's
want to
like,
sell a Range Rover, you go to China.
so I can't blame them for making the calculation that that's where they need to build their business. But it means that they're very reluctant to criticize the government of the People's Republic of China because they want to be there. That's true, I think, of BMW. I think it's true of Daimler. It's really true of most of the major German industrial companies that are at the heart of the European economy. Remember, Germany is the most important economy, and it's important because of its manufacturing exports. So that's why when the United States comes along and says, you can't buy stuff from Huawei, please don't, have 5G technology from somewhere else, the Europeans are like, no, because Huawei is an apparently ideal partner, offering 5G technology, hardware much cheaper than it's available from anywhere else. In Cold War I, there was a non-aligned movement. There were a bunch of countries, India and Yugoslavia, who said, we don't want to take sides here, we want to be in the middle in a kind of neutral position. In Cold War II, the non-aligned movement could be much larger. Indeed, all of Europe seems to be seeking non-alignment. It certainly would rather not choose. Remember also that Europeans despise Donald Trump.
Particularly the Germans.
Especially the Germans who have a particular aversion to him. But I mean, if you look at polling generally in Western Europe, whereas they were very enthusiastic about Barack Obama, maybe more than Americans were, they're very negative about Trump. And so that means that when the Trump administration shows up and asks for anything, their immediate reaction is no, nein. The Chinese have been quite effective at playing the Europeans off against one another. Chinese strategy for years has been pretend the European Union's not there and just go one national capital at a time. Paris, Berlin, London, divide and rule. And that's been quite effective for them. So as a result, I think that Europe is not at all with the program when it comes to Cold War II, when it comes to standing up to Chinese expansion. And indeed, if anything, Europe shows signs of going in the other direction, almost into the Chinese embrace. Quite a number of EU countries have signed up for One Belt, One Road, not just Italy. And so I think when Kissinger said recently, if things go wrong, Europe ends up as an appendage of a Chinese-dominated Eurasia, and the United States is reduced to the role of the offshore balancer, I think that's what he was talking about.
Did you enjoy this conversation? To keep up to date with new episodes, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell.